Hey everybody, it's Friday morning. I just got the lights turned on, so we're going to take a quick trip around the world. Not a lot going on in the fish room, but I have made a few changes and we can talk about them as we go around the room. So the pond is still just ticking over like it always does. No real issues, no concerns. I have been using my pond, as I always do, as a repository for all of my excess duckweed and water sprite. And now I have frog bit that's starting to grow out of control, and I throw it all here in the pond, and the goldfish and koi gobble it up. So there's still a little bit of water sprite floating around, you can see on the surface, but that'll get munched up soon enough. That won't last too much longer. The only real exciting aspect I've got going on here at the pond is you'll notice I've got a bag tied over the top of my terrarium. That is because some of the plants were sort of outgrowing the size in there, and one of them was a big old flower spike. And I found out that that is a orchid. I've never actually had a orchid flower before, let alone one that was planted in soil. So that is kind of interesting. I'm really excited to see whether or not it actually opens. I do have the bag over there to retain the moisture and the humidity, but we're going to have to wait and find out whether it really does open or not. I've been waiting for several days now to see if it does. It actually looks like it is starting to do something. That bottom sort of left-hand corner looks like it's beginning to open up a little bit or something. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I am really excited about that. That is actually the most exciting thing I've got going on in the fish room right now, is an orchid getting ready to bloom. So that would be very exciting if it really does. Alright, other than that, not really a lot going on. I have gotten in and cleaned out the filter in this. I do have an internal filter that just basically filters some of the detritus out. It's underwater down here, and it gives me some circular water flow clockwise around the pond. And then I have a second pump in there pumping water up and out through the water intake there, and that pump was also getting a little bit clogged up. I've got to get in there occasionally and clean that out. I do have another flower bract here on the peace lily. Couldn't remember what that was called there. I got distracted by waiting to see whether we dumped a whole bunch of pollen out of there or not, but so far it doesn't look like it's ready to start dumping the pollen. Pretty soon it will be, though. So alright, that is a look at what's going on with the pond. And we're just going to move around and hit all the tanks around the room. So let me turn the pond off. That'll make a little less glare on some of the other tanks. In my 29 miscellaneous here, nothing really going on. The plants are still getting a little bit out of control. I'm probably going to have to get in there at some point and deal with them. It's usually about once a year I have to get in here and deal with the plants, but you can see the Java fern on the left is getting a little bit out of control, and at some point this Anubias here on the right is going to have to get trimmed down again. I've already cut that back once. It's been months and months since I've done so, and it is recovering. I cut it off about down here somewhere, and so all this stuff you see up on the top is all new growth that's come back since I cut that. But again, that was probably nigh on a year ago, so I don't know how often I have to actually get in there and do it. This is my slowest growing tank, most likely because it is also the tank that has stock aquarium lighting on it. It just has these little LEDs that come with it as part of the kit, and so it's not a very brightly lighted aquarium. If we move on to my 55-gallon gourami tank, this, like most of my aquariums, is very well lighted. I have floodlights in here. I do have them reduced in intensity. I have them on a dimmer, so they're turned down to about 1/3 of their actual overall output, but it's still 4 outdoor floodlights over one small 55-gallon tank. So even at 1/3 output, they are still producing a lot of light. And so most of my tanks are really, really heavily lighted, and I do get a lot of growth on my everything. The algae, the cyanobacteria, the plants, the floating plants, the rooted plants, everything grows like crazy in my tanks because they get loads and loads of light, and I'm not worried about nutrient loads building up. I often have high levels of nitrate and phosphate in my tanks. They're not really concerns of mine. and as a result I get all of this lush, thick vegetation. So it's not a difficult decision for me to not do the water changes as frequently. They definitely make my tanks look better when I do less water changes. So there you go, nothing really going on with the gourami tank. My discus that I've added here recently is alive and well. You can see very bright colors, and then of course that angelfish that I put in this tank is also doing very well. It's interesting to see though that the discus does not seem to like the angelfish. Doesn't really bother any of the other fish, but the discus will chase the angelfish away if it gets too close to it. I'm surprised they're actually sitting this close together right now. They're probably aware of me and think food's coming, and so they've put their differences aside for the moment. But everybody in this tank is doing really well. I'm really excited to see these discus grow up. I do have 2 more of these discus. We'll get to them at the latter part of this video, but I do have more of those. I was given 3 of these discus originally. This one was getting bullied by the other 2 that had paired off, and so I separated this one out and put it in my gourami tank, and again, so far it's doing really well. So let us move on to my 55-gallon tank. This tank, once upon a time, was completely filled with crypt. I still have a bucket of crypt right there. If you want more crypt than you know what to do with, you can email me, contact me. $25 will get you a huge package of more crypt than you will know what to do with. But I am not giving it away for free. It is for $25. I've had people interested, but they seem to think I was just going to give it to them for free. So if you're interested in buying some aquarium plants, I do have more crypt than I know what to do with. I can also scrape up some water sprite, and I've got Java moss, and I can give you Java fern, and if you want it, if you're a masochist, I can give you some duckweed or some frog bit. I got all kind of plants available. So if you're interested in some aquarium plants and you want an awful lot of crypt, then shoot me an email. You can find my email in the description down below. Otherwise, not a lot going on here in the tank. You can see a little bit better now how we've got some woodwork in here that was never really visible before, and you can also see how that woodwork has got the Java moss growing on it, and we're going to have to get in there and stay vigilant with keeping the Java moss off of everything. You can see how it's attached to the rocks, and I've got it growing on my filter intake, and a little bit here, a little bit there. And of course all that sort of red, it actually comes out looking purple on my phone for some reason. That in the tank to me looks like a sort of reddish, purpley, rusty color, but it comes out very, very purpley looking on camera here for some reason. But all that redness you see is cyanobacteria. Not hurting anything. In fact, I think it adds to the patina. It makes it look nice if it doesn't get too out of control in there. But that red cyanobacteria is the stuff that really smells bad. So if you do get the red cyanobacteria, you might want to treat the tank and get rid of it. In fact, I might actually treat this tank to get rid of that while it's still, you know, a small amount of it. I don't want to let it get overrunning the tank before I try to get in there and do something about it. The final point on this tank before we move on is that I do have a sick discus in here. We can't really see it at the moment. It is down, lying on the bottom in the back. It's got a bad swim bladder and cannot keep itself buoyant in the water. And so it spends most of its time just lying on the bottom until feeding time. And then when I throw some food in there, it'll come out and swim around and get some food. But it spends the rest of its time just lying on the bottom. So I don't know how long that discus is going to be around. Probably not too much longer. But I've treated the tank. I've given it medication. It didn't make it any better. And other than that, I don't really know what to do with it. So I'm going to say I did what I can do. And if nature takes its course, nature's going to take its course. You know, losing fish is just part of the hobby. And so unfortunately, I think we're probably going to be losing one of my discus here in the fairly near future. But we'll see. Moving on to my 40 breeder here. This filter was beginning to get to be a pain in my butt. You can see how there's some standing water in the container down there. The filter was leaking. The filter intake back here in the back was getting clogged up on a regular basis, which was causing, you know, a blockage. And then I would get a vapor lock, and the filter would stop running for a few days until I would come down and get it cleaned out and running again. And so I just decided it would be a lot easier all the way around if I just went ahead and turned that filter off. And so this tank is now what most people would probably call filterless, but it's not really filterless. The tank filters itself. It all depends on how you define a filter. This does not have a mechanical store-bought electrified filter on it, but the tank itself functions as its own filter. I've got all the biological filtration I need right within the tank. Either the microbial life that will treat it as though you might think of a standard nitrogen cycle, and then of course I have all of these plants in here that will also deal with any waste byproducts like ammonia or nitrite or nitrogen compounds. I got the fast-growing duckweed on the top. In fact, I'm going to be getting in here one of these days soon and skimming some of this duckweed off the surface. It's getting a little bit out of control. This is just a pothos plant lying in the tank, so that's not really part of the tank, but it's kind of part of the tank because you can see the roots are very much a part of this tank. I do have a little power head there in the back. You can see how it's moving the water around. I have another power head on the bottom down here facing this way, blowing water across the back of the tank. And then I also have the air stone in there for added gas exchange. So it looks like there's no real circulation or movement in this tank, but there is actually quite a bit of circulation and water movement in this tank, which is what allows it to stay healthy, considering there's no filtration on there. I do have the spray bar still attached. Whether you can see it or not, the spray bar is still in there, and I have all the plumbing still hooked up. It's just not actually turned on, and you can see how still the surface of the water is because of that. So there you go, everybody. For anybody that thinks that my, I was talking trash when I was talking about how my tanks could withstand having the filters removed and everything would function fine. Well, there you go. I would say this tank looks like it's functioning fine. I don't know what your definition of fine is, but that looks fine to me. And it's been a couple of weeks now since I've taken that filter and simply unplugged it and turned it off. You can see the cord line there on the floor. So if you want to call that a no filter tank, you can call that a no filter tank. I personally still believe that it is filtered. It's just not mechanically filtered with an electric filter. So there you go. That is my 40 breeder, now filterless. Moving on to my other 125 Daryl. Nothing really to speak of in here. I'm still down to the one undying Gambusia. I had two of them, but one of them turned out to die after all. And so I'm down to the one left that just seems to live and live and live forever. Not really much to speak about otherwise. I'm thinking about putting some of that crypt that I've got in this tank rather than just throwing it away. But I have silver dollars in this tank, and they will make short work of soft plant like crypts. I can barely get this Anubias to grow in here. You can see the chomps and the teeth marks around the edges. You can see how stunted and chopped down it is. You don't really get good vigorous growth on the Anubias until it goes up out of the water. And in fact, I'm actually getting a little flower bract developing on this one here. But that's what Anubias looks like when it grows emergent. Now, obviously, this is under all of that really bright light. Again, I've got these floodlights. They are turned down to 1/3 their output, but that's still an awful lot of light for Anubias, which tend to be lower light plants. So these leaves that tend to get out a little bit, too under the light tend to get burned up a little bit, but the ones further here in the back that aren't in the direct light do really well. So that big old Anubias is still growing and doing fine, but this one down here is struggling a little bit because it keeps getting chomped on by the silver dollars. They are very aggressive when it comes to eating plants. So I'm thinking about putting some of that crypt in here just to give them something to eat. I know it wouldn't grow, but they would eat it, and that's free plant food. So instead of just throwing it away, I can go ahead and feed my fish with it. So moving on to my shrimp tank. The shrimp tank is still doing well. I did put we're not going to be able to see it because my duckweed and frog bit is doing well in this tank too. But I did put a piece of magnolia leaf in there, and that is the magnolia leaf, and it does not look like it has been so much as nibbled on. When I put the Indian almond leaves in there, they get devoured. They're nothing but a leaf skeleton within a few days. That has been in there for several days now. It's been in there for a couple of weeks, honestly, I think, and we're still not seeing any eating on the rhododendron leaf, so maybe the rhododendron leaves are not the way to go. I do still have issues with snails. I will get in there after this video. I'll collect out a handful of those snails. You can see I got a bunch on the glass. This used to be a snail breeding tank, and I clearly did not sterilize it between when I switched over from snails to shrimp. So I've got a lot of shrimp in here, but I also have a lot of snails in here. And if you will look in the back, you'll see all that white stuff. That is crushed coral. I do keep some crushed coral in the tank just to keep some mineralization going on in the water. However, when you look at it from the front like this, you don't really notice it or see any of the white rocks in the back. But that is giving some water hardness and some mineralization, putting a little bit of calcium, a little bit of magnesium in the water. But more importantly, I'm putting carbonate in the water, and the carbonate will keep the pH up around 7.6, and that's good for the shrimp. They need the pH to be above neutral. You don't want to have any kind of shelled animal, whether it's a shrimp or snails or some other type of crustacean. If you keep them in acidic water, the acid will dissolve away the calcium carbonate that their shell is made out of. So shrimp might be a little different. Their shells aren't quite made out of calcium carbonate the way the snails are. Other crustaceans like crayfish, likewise, they don't have calcium carbonate based shells, but they do need plenty of calcium in their diet in order to slough their shells properly. So by keeping the calcium carbonate in the tank, dissolved into the water, and then of course they get all of their fish food and their food that's designed specifically for shrimp. So I would imagine between all of those together, my shrimp are getting all the calcium carbonate they need. So once again, I will get in here right after this video is over. I'll come back in and we'll do a quick scoop on some of those snails and get them out of there. See if we can get a look at them from the inside. So you can see how they collect up around the water surface and they get on the plants. They're not hurting anything. They're not killing any of my live plants. You can see my crypt in there still looks good. Java in there still looks good, and then obviously all the floating plants still look amazing. So they're not anything but a visual nuisance. I don't mind having them in there. I just wish there wasn't quite so many of them in there. I don't like to see these huge clusters of snails. Other than that, I don't mind seeing the snails around the tank. That's just part of an aquatic environment as far as I'm concerned. I always see snails when I look in water when I'm out and about. Alright, moving on to my ham tank. It's actually my fancy goldfish tank, but I refer to it as my ham tank because these guys always ham it up whenever I put a camera in front of them. So nothing really to talk about in this tank either. We can almost say this tank is unfiltered, although I do have the sponge filter for extra biological filtration. It doesn't do a whole lot. I don't have a real vigorous air stone on it, but it is doing some biological filtration for me. Goldfish produce a very, very high bioload. They're little eating and pooping machines. And so in a smaller tank like this is just a 40 breeder, I want to make sure I've got a lot of biological filtration, and so I've put that little extra sponge filter in the back. Now remember, the sponge filters are good for biological filtration, but they do very little for mechanical filtration. That filter back there is not sucking the fish poop up off the bottom and trapping it in the filter. That is just very slowly moving water through it, and all of that surface area allows for the biological filtration to happen. So we're not getting a lot of mechanical filtration, just biological filtration with that sponge filter. My mechanical filtration comes from these filters, and as you can see, the water is backflowing and not really flowing through where the filter areas are supposed to be, because they are super duper clogged up. I haven't changed these filters in I don't even know how long it's been, probably months. So the water's not really flowing through the filter anymore. It's just kind of flowing in and then flowing back out, and so these are really glorified power heads at this point. They're just moving water around. They're not really filtering it for me anymore, and that's kind of why I say this is sort of an unfiltered tank. I've got circulation, but I don't have the real mechanical filtration that you would think of. There's no piece of filter floss in here that is collecting detritus or anything. I mean, you can see the water's not even flowing on this side of it anymore. That's what my filter looks like. So it's pretty safe to say that the water is just flowing in here and then just flowing right back out, and this is acting as nothing more than a very elaborate power head. It is not acting like a filter at all anymore, and of course we'll see the same exact thing if we open that up. But my biggest concern with this tank is that because I have a fully lighted floodlight over this tank, there's no reduction in power output on that one. That's a full crank outdoor floodlight, and as a result I get a lot of algae growing on the glass, and I have to get in here and wipe the glass down so we can see the fish. But other than that, the tank itself, the water quality, the health of the fish, etc., that's all doing great. People put a lot more weight in their aquarium filters than they probably should, and it all depends on how you've got your tank set up. There are some tanks that really do need to have that external filtration on there, and the tank would crash and collapse and everybody in it would die if those filters weren't working properly. I set my tanks up so that that filter is not necessary. I'm terrible at remembering after water changes to turn stuff back on and plug stuff back in, and many times over the years I have left filters unplugged after water changes, and so I learned long ago to set my tanks up so that if I do that, it won't cause any kind of catastrophe. And so at this point I don't even need to have those filters on my tanks at all if I don't want them to. So moving on to my Discus tank. It's another 125 gallon tank. It looks like my Synodontis catfish is out for a moment. You can see some little glimpses of silhouette, and now my Synodontis catfish is hiding again, as it always does. I rarely ever see that fish, and I'm not even sure what species it is. I bought it as one species. It's clearly not that species, and so I don't really know what it is. I got in here recently, did some serious grooming to my red tiger lotus, which is a type of water lily. I had that conversation the other day. Some people insist that tiger lotus are not water lily. Other people say that they are just water lily, and the truth is somewhere in between. They are water lilies, but they are not the hardy water lilies that you will see around here in the northern hemisphere. Here in North America, you see water lilies in people's ponds all the time, and those are hardy water lilies. These are tropical water lilies. These do not overwinter the way a standard water lily would, etc. But a lotus is in fact a type of water lily. So the lotus flower is a lily, it's a water lily, and if you really technically wanted to call the red tiger lotus a water lily, you could. You just have to acknowledge that it is a tropical water lily and not a hardy water lily. But otherwise, it's just a water lily. Java fern, lots of Java fern. We've got my crypt down here. We just cleaned a bunch of that out of my other tank, so I don't need to add any to this one. And then down here we've got my discus all hanging out, chilling out. I recently had another discus spawn. I do have a mated pair in here, and every so often they will lay eggs. Unfortunately, every time they do it, they lay them on my heater, and then as soon as the heater comes on, it kills all the eggs. So I've never had anything ever happen with any of the eggs other than watching them get laid. And so I guess these two right here are probably the pair, and then all the ones that are being sort of to themselves down at this end are all the other individuals in the tank. I do have 8 of them in there. I have 4 of the red turquoise, and then 4 of the blue diamonds, which don't have the patterning on them. They're just solid blue like that. Actually, I have 5 and 3 now that I'm thinking about it. I don't have 4 and 4. I have 5 of the turquoise, and I have 3 of the blue diamonds. So there you go, just a quick look at the discus tank. Again, no luck with the spawn. I have tried putting slate in there. I've leaned the slate up against the filter so that maybe they would go in the same area, or possibly the slate would make the filter, or the heater would make the slate warmer, and they would use that as a, you know, they'd spawn on the slate or something, but nothing ever came of it, and I eventually just took the slate out of there because it looked ugly. And then, of course, now they're breeding on the filter again. So I might try sticking one of those filter or breeding cones in there and see if a breeding cone isn't something that would get them to stop laying on the filter. I don't know, but I definitely don't want them laying on the filter anymore. Alright, moving along to my Betta fish tank. Not much to talk about here other than a recent water change. I got in there and we cleaned out a bunch of floating floating duckweed. I thinned out all this water sprite. I took out all of the little plantlets that were developing on the main body, and that allows for a lot more light to get into the tank. And you can actually see the fish in there a little bit better. But other than that, nothing really to speak of in here. Probably a little more water circulation going around the tank than my Betta fish down there would prefer. But I have figured out that he is taken to getting inside that cluster of tree roots and just laying low and staying out of the water current. And he actually even props himself up so that he doesn't have to expend any energy floating. He just sits on the wood in there and hangs out. So he's found himself a nice spot out of the water current. Quarantine tank, I did a water change on that yesterday. I'm getting that ready. I'm going to be putting some shrimp in there at some point. But for now, it's just an empty quarantine tank. So last but not least is my 40 breeder. This used to be Butterbean's tank once upon a time. Butterbean is no longer with us. We lost Butterbean quite a while ago. And so this tank is now filled with minnows. You can see one of my Discus in the back there. And the other Discus is probably, sure enough, hiding in the back over on this corner. So nothing really to talk about in here. This is the next tank I need to get in and do some maintenance on. We've got a lot of grunge on the glass. It's just algae growing on the glass. The water itself is perfectly clear, although I do have a good amount of duckweed in here as well. I have gotten rid of some of the duckweed recently, but I do need to get rid of more of it. But if you look at the water itself is crystal clear. There's no issue with that. It's just that the glass itself has a lot of algae growing on it, and it makes everything look really grungy. So we've got the nest all stirred up. Everybody thinks it's feeding time now, and so the minnows are going crazy. And I still have not identified them. I don't know exactly what species they are. They are just some random minnows. That's all I'm going to call them from now on. I think I might have some shiners, and I think I might have some Notropus species, but I don't know which Notropus species they are, and I don't know which shiners they are, and so we're just going to go ahead and call them minnows because that sums up a lot of different fish. A little bit of trivia. Did you know that carp are minnows? If you look at the definition of a minnow and what makes a minnow, carp, with all their immensity, huge 3 feet long and weighing 30 pounds and whatnot, carp are indeed a type of minnow. So, none of these are carp. I think they're Notropus species, and I think they are shiners, but I'm not 100% sure. So, not a lot going on here, just to look at the tank real quick, and an acknowledgement that I do need to get in there and do some work. We'll get the water changed, we'll get the glass wiped down, and we'll get the tank looking pretty again. So there you go, everybody. That is a trip all the way around the world. Oh, and there is a look at my Discus that's not doing well. You can see how it is swimming constantly, trying to stay in the water column. It just has no more buoyancy anymore, and so I think it's got a bad swim bladder. Again, I've medicated it. I've given it antibiotics. I don't know, other than giving it other different antibiotics, I don't really know what I can do about medicating it or whatever. We're just going to do our best to hope it recovers, keep it comfortable, as they say, and we'll see what happens in the long run. But I'm not expecting it to be with us for too terribly much longer. Alright everybody, I managed to wind this up in half an hour even, so thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss anything I've got coming up. Thanks again, and I will see you real soon on the next one.